Hello and welcome back to Residentials, Commercials, and Industrials. In part two of talking about these zones, what we're going to do is focus more on the mechanics of them rather than the numbers. And what I'm going to do first is talk about industrial zones. So we're going to kind of go in reverse order. Okay, so with industrial zones, they are actually the easiest zone to build. You can put them literally anywhere on the map and they will develop. You could put it, well, you see I have some here. You could put it here, here. You could put it all the way in the corner of the map right here. Doesn't matter where I place them, they will always develop. Okay? Industrial zones are immune to crime and pollution. They don't care about those. They will develop no matter what. Typically, you see industrial zones on the edges and corners of the map because they emit pollution. And pollution will decrease land value, but they are really easy to build. And that's about it, I gotta say. There's not much else to say about industrial zones. Pretty easy to develop, pretty easy to lay out. So we're going to leave it like that. Let's talk about residential and commercial zones now. We'll start with commercial zones. Commercial zones have similar properties to industrial zones. They are immune to pollution and they are immune to crime. They are also immune to really low land values. However, they are only immune to these things after they've been developed. So let me show you an example. Here's a commercial zone. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ensure it has the best possible scenario to develop into a C5 high. So I'm going to surround it with park. Now the forest counts as park. That's why I'm not going over it. We're going to give it some power, some rail. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put a police department by it too. Let's just put the police department like kind of like opposite of the rails there. And I actually have this on pause. Let's fast forward and see what happens. Notice that this commercial zone developed into a C5 high. I gave it the optimal conditions to do that. There is high land value around it. The police department would lower crime. And the pollution which is emitted by the industrial zones is away from this commercial zone. But now that it's a fully developed commercial zone, I can literally bulldoze that police department, and I could even go as far as doing this. So let's give these some rail. And I want you to take notice of what happens. That's right. Nothing happened. Nothing happened to this commercial zone. That is because once it's fully developed, it is immune to everything that can be thrown at it. This includes the pollution and crime as well as the lower land values. If I were to now bulldoze this commercial zone and put one now, let's see what happens. Notice anything different? What you should notice here is that this commercial zone is not developing. This is a C1 low. The reason it's not developing is there's probably high crime, there's pollution surrounding it, and there's no park to help raise the land value. So the difference between an industrial zone and a commercial zone is you can put an industrial zone anywhere in any spot in any situation and it will develop. For a commercial zone, you have to give it the optimal conditions for it to develop, but once it's developed, it will stay that way. It will not revert back due to things like pollution. When you're building, what you end up doing is, for commercial zones, you give them optimal conditions. Then once they get to the level that you want them to be at, you can then build industrial zones around them. The question is it possible to ever get a commercial zone to kind of revert back? The answer is yes. The only way to make a commercial zone revert back is if commercial demand plummets. So let me show you an example of that. The reason commercial demand, which we can see up here, this is the RCI meter. If this bar gets to halfway or lower, it's in prime position to lower the development of other commercial zones to try and balance this back out. So let's just build way too many commercial zones just to show you. What we want to focus on is this one. This is a fully developed C5 high. Let's see if we can lower the demand from building too many commercial zones. Okay. It's going down. Now, these are the ones that might get lowered to try and balance it out, but let's just kind of watch and see what happens. Did you see that? Let's pause. This commercial zone reverted back down a level. It even lost its ability to be a high. Remember, when a C5 high is fully developed, you can then do whatever you want with it and it will stay a C5 high. But if you ever come into a situation like this where it will revert back due to low demand, because I don't have any police departments anymore or park or any of that, it may revert to a commercial zone that's lower than a high. That is why, as I mentioned in the introduction video, the startup bug is just so bad. Because the startup bug is going to produce really high crime, and it's going to kill the power off everything just for a little bit, and things like this can happen. And the only way I could ever get this to recover is I would essentially have to start over here. I would have to get rid of all of this, and possibly this, surround it with park, get it to where I want, and then I can go from there. So commercial demand dropping is the only thing that a commercial zone is not immune to. Now if I bulldoze these and I turn this back on, okay, the RCI meter recovers, it balances back out. But notice what happened here is, okay, it turned into a fully developed C upper, but I lost a high. Now, that's not that big of a deal because, as you know, a C5 high and a C5 upper have the same population. But if this was supposed to be a commercial zone that would eventually pair with another high to make a top, that's bad. So again, you may have to like bulldoze it, rebuild it, surround it with park to get the land value up. Okay, now let's see if this is enough land value. And it is. The park is providing enough land value to get the commercial zone back to a C5 high. Now, if I was in a situation where I wanted to make this to a top by putting a commercial zone adjacent to it, I could do that. Okay. So while commercial zones are immune to a lot of things, you need to be careful with the commercial demand. Again, that is the only thing that will knock them out. And you can see that, okay, this was one zone that reverted to an upper. Imagine if you dropped commercial demand and you had like a whole bunch of commercial zones here and they all just reverted back. That might be something that you can't fix and you may have to start over on. So just be careful that you don't let the RCI meter get out of whack. I will be talking about the RCI meter a bit more in another video, probably with land value, but for now, you just need to know that you want to make sure your commercial demand is high so that these don't ever revert back and they are permanently what you want. The same thing can happen to an industrial zone. If the industrial demand were to go down, these would revert back. Though that's not as big of a deal because they will just develop back to whatever they were before. Another thing I didn't really mention with industrial zones is there's a I high and a I low. I only have highs here. There's no difference between an I high and an I low other than how they look. They do have the same population as 640, so you don't ever have to worry about that. Let's take a look at residential zones now. So I'm going to build a residential zone here. I'm going to give it some rail to this commercial zone. I'm going to surround it by park. You're probably wondering real quick, what's all this? This is the first save state of my 900,000 city. So I am just building off it because we have all this space. If we want to use it, we've already got a little bit developed. Okay. So let's fast forward now. And we get an R5 high. Now, just to review here, this building has the same population as these R5 uppers. So all these have the same population of 800. This C5 high has a population of 800 too. So if I were to get some industrial zones, like I did with the commercial zone and surround them, like this, let's see what happens. Well, that didn't take long. This is actually an R low. We can look at the magnifying glass. An R3 low, to be exact. And what you notice is like the residential zone completely crapped out when I have these industrial zones around it. One difference between residential and commercial zones is residential zones are very finicky and more unstable than commercial zones. They will revert back if there's too much pollution on them, or the crime is high and they're in places with low land value. If I were to bulldoze these industrial zones and put my park back, like that, it developed back into an upper. Now, if I were to bulldoze it and just kind of do this, it should go back to a high. The reason it turned into an upper is even though I put park, the game didn't have enough time to quote unquote calculate all the park that I just put back in where the industrial zones were. So it only had enough, I guess, to make it an upper. But if I kind of fast forward and let the game get it all sorted through, bulldoze, I can get my residential high back. Not that it would matter because an R high and R upper fully developed have the same population, but again, if I wanted to get this into a top at some point, it needs to be an R5 high. So residential, commercial, and industrial zones do have similarities and differences. Your residential zones are going to be a lot more sensitive to things. They are not immune to pollution, crime, and really low land value. So it's important to keep that in mind. I would like to now showcase one other major difference between residential and commercial zones. If I turn the power on here, I want you to take notice of what happens. What you should notice is my residential zone completely developed, and while I could keep holding the fast forward key and wait for this commercial zone to develop, it's actually going to not develop anymore. Looking at the magnifying glass, this is only a C3 upper, and it has stopped developing. Why did this fully develop, but this didn't? Is it because they're placed in particular places that develop? Well, let's flip the positions and see if that's the case. As you can see, my residential zone completely developed, and my commercial zone is still lagging behind the residential zone as far as developing. A big difference between a residential and a commercial zone is that in order for a commercial zone to fully develop, it needs high land value. In particular, if we look at the land value map here, if you want to get a fully developed C upper, it needs to be the color yellow on the land value screen. So there's my commercial zone. It is not yellow. If you ever get a commercial zone in these greens, what you're going to notice is it will partially develop, but not fully develop. It will either be a partially developed low, mid, or upper. So let's try to get a fully developed C upper here. I'm just going to add a little bit of park at a time. Okay, so we added some park around it and we were able to get a fully developed C upper. If we were to look at the map now, you notice that, and again we'll do this first, here is the commercial zone. If I hit the land value, this commercial zone's all yellow. All yellow is required to make it a fully developed C upper. So again, if I get rid of this park and put my commercial zone there again, it is not developing. And if we look at the map, it's shades of green. With shades of green, you're not going to get a commercial zone to fully develop. You can even go for the C5 high if you're wanting to get a top eventually. So let's surround this with a whole bunch of park. And then fast forward. A fully developed C5 high, looking at the map, this is where the commercial zone is, and if it's orange or higher, it's going to become a C5 high, which is what we have here. Now, just because you add park around it doesn't mean it's going to help. There's going to be a lot of scenarios, especially on the edges of the map, where as you're building, you're doing everything you can to get the land value up for the commercial zone, but it's still not enough. And that's going to happen from time to time. Those are the situations on the edges where I replaced those partially developed commercial zones with industrial zones. Residential zones, on the other hand, will develop. However, the catch to those is they are sensitive to pollution, low land value, and crime. If you have lots of those things around a residential zone, it won't stop developing per se, but it will fluctuate up and down. It won't be stable. Whereas a commercial zone won't fluctuate, it will just stop developing and just be paused in a certain position. The next thing I want to talk about is tops. So tops are really interesting in this game. You have an R top that can be vertical or horizontal, and you have a commercial top which can be vertical or horizontal as well. The first thing I'd like to tell you about tops is, well, let's get one real quick. Let's build a vertical top. And let me just do this. Okay. Was going to talk about this in a little bit, but since we see this, I think we can talk about it now. You notice I get a hospital with this residential zone. So residential zones have the ability to turn into schools or hospitals. You should bulldoze them immediately when you see them and just replace it until you get houses. Schools and hospitals don't contribute to population. They have a population of 0. And so then if you want to get the biggest city possible, you don't want to have schools or hospitals. You do need schools and hospitals for gift requirements. But what you can do there is just build like random residential zones in some empty space and work on getting gift requirements. For example, to get a library, you need 3, 6, and 9 schools respectively. So you could like go off to the side and keep bulldozing residential zones that have houses until they turn into schools, for example. But in spots where you're actually trying to build, you just want to bulldoze them immediately and build your zones with housing. I will say, once you get your gifts, you can actually just bulldoze the schools and hospitals afterward, and you'll still have your gifts. Residential and commercial tops. Here's our residential top. The first property that I'm going to talk about is transportation. When you get a top, all calculations are done on the top portion of a vertical top and the left portion of a horizontal top. And when I say left and top, let's just build 2 more residential zones. So the top is the zone composing of the top half. And when I talk about a horizontal top, the left is the left zone that composes of the left half of the top. For transportation purposes, you only need to give this R-top rail to the top half, or transportation to the top half. So if I were to just like do that, and then let's just give it some power this way, delete this rail, you will notice that upon fast forwarding, this top is not reverting back into 2 R5 highs. It's maintaining its ability to be a top, and that is because we have power and transportation to it. The transportation being on the top half. The bottom half is not used in any of the calculations when you are dealing with the top. It's only the top half. The top half is dealt with the crime, pollution, and land value calculations as well. You could also put this on the side. So remember 1, 2, 3. So I could do this if I wanted to. Go back to this. Let's just delete some of this. And fast forwarding, it doesn't revert back. But if you were to try it the other way, let's say we want to put the power and rail just on the bottom. If I delete this, it reverts back. And actually the top zone now will just go all the way back like that because it has no transportation anywhere. when you are building a top, both of the R5 highs need transportation until it becomes a top. So this one will need rail to a destination. Let's just do that. And I don't want to cut the rail off to this one, even though it's fully developed, until they become a top. Now that it has become a top, I'm just going to move this power line here. I can delete all the rail on the bottom one, and it will maintain its top. It will not revert back. We can do this with horizontal tops as well. So let's go ahead and build a horizontal top. You need to provide transportation to the left and the right zone first, and once it tops, we can then just only have transportation to the left half. Give it some power. Okay, so we're going to leave the rail on that and let this right one develop. Okay, so now what I can do is, if I really wanted to, I could just go like rail like this. This has power, so we'll just kind of do this. This needs power though, so I'll just do this, and it stays atop. It doesn't revert back. But if I were to put it on the right side and eliminate this, notice it goes back. So again, the calculations are not done on the right side or the bottom of a top. So now I need to fix this top by doing this. And because this is not a top anymore, this needs a destination somewhere temporarily. So I'm going to do that. Oh, I got a fountain. And I got a top. So now I can bulldoze this, and we're good to go. This behavior is the same for a commercial top. You can get a horizontal or a vertical commercial top. So you only need transportation again on the left and the top half of a commercial top as well. The next thing I want to do is talk a little bit more about the mechanics of residential and commercial tops besides transportation. So I told you earlier that only calculations on the top and the left are being done for any top in general. Okay. With that being said, you can kind of get away with a couple things. So let me show you something interesting. Normally a residential zone does not want pollution around it. We've seen this in the example earlier, where I surrounded the residential zone with industrials and it immediately went to a low. But with a top, there are situations where you can kind of get away with the industrial zones being by the residential zones. The reason for this is because, again, the bottom zone is not partaking in any of the calculations being done. So in this residential zone, as long as I can keep the land value and everything good for the top zone, then it doesn't matter what the land value is for this bottom zone. And so if I put a police department here for police coverage, I have a lots of park to keep the land value up. If I turn this back on, look at that. The residential top actually stayed atop, even though there's an industrial zone next to it. That's because the top half is in a good position. The bottom half doesn't matter. Notice what happened? When I put industrial zones around the top half of the residential top, it reverted back. Now, this one is houses because now when it broke off to a top, this has no rail, so it has no destination. Oh, but look at this. This high has succumbed to the pollution and it's reverted to a mid. So crime and pollution and low land values can still affect a top if it's a residential top. Remember, residential zones are very sensitive. So you just got to be careful. This zone right here was not the reason why this broke up, because this is away from the top half. These two zones affected the land value of the top half of the zone, and so it reverted back. If I were to have a horizontal top, I might have been able to get away with putting an industrial zone next to the right half of the zone. And then be good to go, because the left half is where all the calculations are done. When it comes to a commercial top, remember that commercial zones are immune to crime and pollution once you get them fully developed. So if I have a commercial top and I surround it with industrial zones, it won't revert back because it's immune. Here's my city again, and I kind of want to show you, since we've been talking about residential tops, another example of getting away with industrial zones around residential zones. You see, this residential top is surrounded by industrial zones, but the left half of it is near water, and there's park as well. The land value on the left half of this top is high enough to where this top maintains being a top. If this industrial zone were right here, where this commercial zone is, this would most certainly decay into two residential zones that were either lows or mids. Maybe an upper, since it's by water still, but it would not maintain this. You can see this example right here. This industrial zone is by this residential zone, but because it's by the bottom of it and not the top of it, it maintains being a residential top because the calculations are done in the top part. And the top part is surrounded by park and water. If you look in the bottom left of this map, you will see that my industrial zones surround a lot of these commercial tops, which is okay because they are immune to pollution. When it comes to the transportation, like I mentioned before, you only need transportation on the top or the left half of a commercial and residential top. Because of this, you can kind of pack zones in a lot more together. Take a look at the commercial tops right here. Because the bottom portion doesn't need transportation, I can literally surround them by zones and pack in as many zones as I can. These two don't have any rail on the bottom. This doesn't have any rail on the bottom. This doesn't have any rail on the right side. Right side, bottom, bottom, bottom. You see, you can take advantage of the fact that the rights and the bottoms don't need rail to really squeeze in as many zones as you can. These two don't have rail on the bottom. This residential zone has rail on the left and right, but one thing to keep in mind is no calculations are done with this rail for this zone in particular. It's just there. This rail is actually for this residential top, but it's not doing anything for this top. No rail, no rail. It's a common thing you'll see in my city. No rail on the right side, no rail on the right side, no rail on the right side. If I were not allowed to do this, I would have significantly less zones in this city and thus have way less of a population. What I'd like to do is come back to this save state and show you a little more about residential and commercial tops. Okay, so I'm going to pause it here. There is one big difference between developing a residential top versus developing a commercial top. If you get two R5 highs next to each other, they will always turn into a residential top, period. No matter what. To a certain extent, of course. If I surround it with industrial zones, then obviously it won't develop. But as is, just out here, it will always develop into an R top. If I were to get two R highs all the way away from my city out here, let's just say I were able to do that. As if there are two R5 highs, they will become a residential top. No matter what, no questions asked. And I can turn this on and they will become a top. But if I make a commercial top, we'll go ahead and just make it here since we have a C5 high. What are we going to do? We are going to surround it with park. Okay. Got a commercial top. Let's go back though and do something a little different. I'm going to cut the rail so that the top reverts. And just as a quick review, if I were to only cut this one, you can't see it because the commercial top's covering it. But 1, 2, 3, there's a tile of rail here. Notice the commercial top stays the way it is because the left side is doing all the calculations. But if I were to cut all transportation from the left half, it reverts back. Go put that on real quick. And I want to show you something interesting. Notice anything going on? Well, what you should notice is these are not becoming a top. Why is that? Well, one difference between a residential and commercial top is exactly that. If you have two R5 highs next to each other, it will always turn into a residential top. But if you have two C5 highs next to each other, it doesn't mean you're going to get a commercial top. You see, commercial zones are a bit more picky when it comes to becoming a top. They are more difficult to get. The right conditions need to happen on the left half of this commercial zone in order to make it into a commercial top. What are those conditions exactly? Well, if I go to the land value map right here, in order for this to become, so let's just kind of look at the map again like this. In order for this to become a C top, the left half has to have a land value of orange or higher. If it doesn't have land value of orange or higher, it will stay essentially frozen as two individual commercial zones. These zones are still immune to pollution and crime, but the land value on the left half of this top is not high enough to make them into tops. So if I were to add park around this commercial zone, or at least enough of it, let's see what happens. I think I'm paused. It tops. And if we look at the land value, Sometimes this is hard to do. So what I have to do on my computer is put my finger where the zone is before I hit the land value map. But if you kind of just pay attention and I hit this, the left half is in orange and red. Notice the right half is in green and yellow, but because the left half is doing the calculations, we got our top. And now that we got our commercial top, we can just bulldoze or get rid of all this. Let's just move it so we can see it. Let's just have our rail on that side. We can bulldoze this. We can put industrial zones around it now, and it will not revert back. Oops. So while these industrial zones are developing, I kind of want to summarize residential and commercial tops. Residential tops are easy to get and will always become a top if you have two R5 highs next to each other. However, residential zones are a lot more sensitive to pollution and crime and lower land values. Commercial tops are a lot harder to get, as the left or the top half of the commercial zone needs to have high land value, orange or higher, on the land value map. However, once you get them to develop, they are virtually immune to pollution, land value, low land value, and crime. They are only susceptible to demand dropping out. So there's a trade-off going on here for each one. There's also a trade-off for industrial zones if you really think about it. You can place them anywhere on the map and they will develop. What's the catch for industrial zones? They can only cap at a population of 640 each. I think they kind of knew that industrial zones were going to be pretty easy to develop when they made this game. So I'd like to think that they gave them a lower population because of this. Looking back one more time at my city here, for the exact reasons that I just told you, that's why I have all of these commercial zones on the edges with the industrial zones, because they're immune. They will not revert back. If I made all of these residential zones, they would crap out because there's no land value on the edge for the most part. So you go around and put as many commercial zones as you can. This corner is pretty much industrials and commercial zones. All these commercial zones don't care about the low land value, the high crime, or the pollution. We can even, real quick, for fun, let's look at the crime in the bottom left. It's literally all red, but commercial zones don't care. Going up, commercial zones, industrial zones hanging out together. Top, commercial zones, industrial zones, and so forth. I want to stress, though, you have to get your commercial zone to where you want it to be first before you don't care. You also need to build slowly. If you just build a commercial zone in an environment with poor land value, high pollution, high crime, you're not going to get many C5 highs to develop. It's important that you give it the conditions it needs to develop. Then, once it's fully developed, you can surround it with whatever you want. I hope this helps in understanding residential, commercial, and industrial zones a bit more. I hope it sheds light on why some of the things I did in my city are done that way. Obviously, we haven't shedded light on everything that you see, but for the most part, I think you should start seeing or understanding what I'm doing. on the edges. There's still a lot to be digested in this city that you want to probably know about, but we've made a good start thus